Dublin, capital of British-governed Ireland, on the eve of the First World War. O'Connell Street, named after the great parliamentary nationalist Daniel O'Connell, whose statue faces you at the head of it. At the end of the street, there on the left, by Nelson's Pillar, the triangular roof of the General Post Office, then a building of no special significance. If you could have told passers-by that the post office would, before long, be the headquarters of an Irish Republican rebellion, they would have thought you mad. Southern Ireland was, at this moment, more than at any other in her history, loyal to the British Crown. And the British Crown's Lord Lieutenant, Lord Wimborne, by 1915, had every reason to think that Ireland would remain loyal. For underlying the pomp over which the Lord Lieutenant presided at Dublin Castle was a new political reality. The long dream of Irish nationalists, home rule for all Ireland under the Crown, was fulfilled. The Act was on the statute book, to be put into force as soon as the great war in which Britain and Ireland were now engaged together was over. The winning of Home Rule for Ireland had been the culminating achievement in the long political career of John Redmond, leader of the Irish Nationalist Party in Parliament. With the Irish Catholic people behind him, Redmond was the virtually unchallenged Irish political leader of the day. The determination of Home Rule supporters had been shown before the war, when Southern Irishmen had formed their own companies of volunteers to defend Home Rule against opposition from Ulster Protestants. They were there to strengthen the British government's will to carry Home Rule through. By August 1914, some 200,000 of them under Redmond's control. In return for the passing of the Home Rule Act, Redmond pledged the volunteers' support for the British Army. A very small minority of the volunteers who objected to this split away. The main body of volunteers now responded to the British Army's recruiting campaign in their tens of thousands. In responding to the recruiting drive, Southern Irishmen felt they were going to fight to preserve Home Rule. That in return for their sacrifice, all earlier talk of amending the Home Rule Act to exclude Ulster would be forgotten. That they were making Ireland at last one of the small nations of Europe.
At that time, of course, opinion here was entirely anti-German and pro-British. I remember as a boy the rush, as they called it, to the colours. All my friends and that joined up by the thousand to go out and fight for little Belgium, and as they thought, for the freedom of small nations.
Men of the great Southern Irish regiments, Connaught Rangers, Munster Fusiliers and the rest, marched together with Irishmen from Ulster to slaughter on the battlefields of Europe. A source of pride to most Irish nationalists and an inspiration, it seemed, to the younger generation.
By the time I was old enough to take notice, we were in the Great War of 1418, and there was almost unanimous support for that. The great rush to the colours. One of my earliest recollections, indeed, is the pride and enthusiasm that was aroused when a local chap got the first VC awarded to an Irishman in that war. and he, in fact, got a reception never since surpassed when he came back in 1915 after winning this.
If not surpassed, the reception was at least equalled when another Southern Irish VC, Sergeant O'Leary from County Cork, came home to a tumultuous welcome in Dublin in 1915. But there was another tradition of Irish patriotism, almost forgotten, which, embodied in Dublin by an old Fenian and Republican Tom Clarke, had been working quietly away below the surface. Clarke had spent 15 years in a British jail for trying to set off bomb explosions in British cities. His headquarters now were in his tobacconist shop in Dublin, where congregated some of those minority extremists who'd split from Redmond's volunteers. Just after the outbreak of war, a quite unpublicised meeting had taken place,
where Tom Clarke had made up his mind to advocate that we should make an effort to liberate Ireland during the war. And that meeting decided that there would be a rising after long discussion. We were there for 3 or 4 hours.
Also present at that meeting were Sean McDermott, a Belfast barman who'd been helping Clarke reorganise the old Irish Republican Brotherhood, Patrick Pearse, a poet and schoolmaster, increasingly obsessed with the need for a blood sacrifice for Ireland, and James Connolly, a trade union organiser and socialist Republican who'd already formed an Irish citizen army and who was the most impatient of all to strike for Ireland's separation from the British Crown and an Irish Republic. As a front propaganda organisation, a neutrality league was formed.
Connolly made the opening speech of the Neutrality League the night it was founded. And I never heard a better or more eloquent expression of the reasons, the fundamental reasons for the Irish people's claim to independence and freedom and separation from England than James Connolly made so eloquently that night.
And the planning of a rising for total Irish independence, freedom and separation from England now proceeded behind such front organisations as the Neutrality League and a Wolfe Tone Memorial Committee. It was these people who organised in 1915 a great public funeral for an old Fenian, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. Thousands of ordinary moderate-minded people filed past the open coffin of a man whose extremist patriotism in other times seemed something to which it was now quite fitting to pay respect. An armed guard of honour was provided by that small minority group of volunteers who'd split away from Redmond. Redmond's volunteers were also there that day, marching in long columns, though without arms. Believing that the Home Rule Act fulfilled all Ireland's national aims and that they existed to defend Ireland's new freedom against any amendment, it seemed right to them to pay a qualified martial respect to a patriot who'd favoured other methods in other times. That new men were planning to use such extremist methods in the near future was a thought that kind of entered very few heads that day, on what seemed simply like a great historic occasion, a memorial to Ireland's sad past on the eve of a better future. But the Irish Republicans who'd organised the arrangements for the funeral made sure that it struck a firm military note. And as the coffin was lowered into the grave, one of those Republicans most deeply involved in the secret planning of the rising, Patrick Pearse, in the uniform of the minority Irish volunteers, took a paper from his pocket and delivered a speech stating that the only true future for Ireland lay in the traditions of the past. Railing against the British government, he cried, "The fools, the fools, the fools! They have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." Outside the Irish Transport Union's headquarters at Liberty Hall, Connolly's small Irish citizen army paraded regularly under the watchful eye of James Connolly himself, its commandant. Connolly's impatience for a rising had brought Pearse and the secret group within the minority volunteers to agree to act at Easter 1916. On the 17th of March 1916, St. Patrick's Day, just before Easter, these minority volunteers held a big parade in the centre of Dublin. James Connolly took his own Irish citizen army on a prospective tour of the strategic points of the city.
James Connolly on that day took the citizen army for a route march. He took us up round by Charlemont Street Bridge, along the canal, and stopped at Portobello Bridge, looked up at this big public house that was there and said, "It's a good view from that window. You can see the barracks." He was making suggestions. Then marched down the green and around to the Shelburne Hotel, halted. And he said to the men, marching among the men, he stopped them and said, "That'll make a fine barracks, plenty of food, plenty of beds, you see?" Because this was the plan, that place was to be taken over.
The overall plan was to take over such strategic points in the centre of Dublin as would command British Army approach routes into the city. One garrison at the forecourts to command access from Marlborough and Royal Barracks. A garrison at the South Dublin Union to block access from Richmond Barracks and Kingsbridge Station. Garrisons at Jacob's Biscuit Factory and St. Stephen's Green to block access from Portobello Barracks and Harcourt Street Station. A garrison at Boland's Mill to command the access routes of reinforcements from England. Headquarters was to be the General Post Office in O'Connell Street. But there was another vital part of the plan. From Germany, in the week before the rising, arms for the rebels were on their way to Ireland, and in a German submarine already at sea was a man who'd helped to get them. Sir Roger Casement, an Irish nationalist and former British consular figure. Just before being put ashore by the submarine, he shaved off his beard to make himself less recognizable. Here at Dublin Castle, where the authorities had already been alerted by intelligence to the possibility of a rising, news arrived on Good Friday that a man had been arrested after landing from a German submarine on a lonely beach of County Kerry. The next day, they heard that the man was Casement, and that a German arms ship, which had arrived in the area with him, had scuttled itself. The news seemed very reassuring, because the authorities had wrongly assumed that Casement was the key man in the planning of the rebellion. The secret group that was in fact planning the rebellion, consisting of Tom Clark, the old Fenian, his organising lieutenant, Sean McDermott, the poet and schoolmaster, Patrick Pearse, and James Connolly, this secret group was already in deep trouble. They were paying the price for having had to keep in the dark even the head of the volunteers himself, Owen MacNeill, professor of history and a co-founder of the Gaelic League. MacNeill himself had always thought that the volunteers should only use their arms in self-defense. Then, on being told in the week before Easter that a rising was being planned, he was appalled and determined to stop it. Then he was told that Casement was on the way from Germany with an arms ship, and he reluctantly agreed that a rising should go ahead on Easter Sunday. Now came the news that Casement had been arrested and the arms ship had scuttled itself, and MacNeill went back to his former position.
MacDermott told me that MacNeill was making trouble. And he had definitely, this is MacDermott's statement to me, he had definitely agreed to take part in the rising and for that the volunteers should take part. But now he was changing his mind.
What MacNeill did was to place an advertisement in the Sunday papers that the route marches planned for Easter Sunday, which most of the rank and file thought were only route marches, were cancelled.
We got orders to parade on Sunday at Father Matchell Park. But the newspapers had published by Owen MacNeill that the parade had been cancelled. And I didn't go over to Father Matchell Park, but later in the morning, my section commander, Davy Golden, came and said, "You're not to leave the city tomorrow. There'll be another parade." And later on the night he came to parade at 12 o'clock on Stephen's Green outside the College of Surgeons.
In spite of MacNeill's cancellation, the extremist leaders had decided to go ahead one day late. But what were the authorities here at Dublin Castle doing? Well, not very much. It had long been their policy anyway to tolerate parades and even manoeuvres of the volunteers and citizen army men in the streets of Dublin. And on hearing of Casement's arrest and the scuttling of the arms ship, they felt they could relax. They had finally decided to arrest the leaders of the volunteers, but on thinking that there was now no urgency, they'd also decided that the arrests could wait until after Easter Monday, a public holiday on which probably some of the authorities themselves wanted to go to the very popular race meeting at Fairyhouse. But not everyone in Dublin that Easter Monday morning was going to Fairyhouse races.
So I walked up to Stephen's Green. And on my way up, I met a Lieutenant Shields. He said to me, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going on parade." He said, "Go on home." Naturally, being a kid, I started to cry because I'd been sent home. Put me there on the parade. Now, I didn't know there was anything about a rising or anything else at this time. So I went going home, and I met a man named Mick Colgan. He says, "Where are you going?" So I had been sent home. I said, "Don't mind that fella, come along with me."
Michael O'Reilly, the O'Reilly, had been a founder member of the volunteers. Like MacNeill, he'd been kept in the dark about a rising.
I went over to my uncle's, the O'Reillys, in Herbert Park, and to see what was happening there. He was getting his puttees on. They wore puttees with the uniform in those days, the volunteer uniform, and he was going out. Although he had been against it with Owen MacNeill, he thought the time was not right, that it might be better to wait till after the war and the men came back from the trenches and that they'd all join in. But, as he said himself, when he had been in it from the very beginning and when they decided to go ahead, he joined them. And he was preparing to go out, so I didn't want to be there when he'd be saying goodbye to his wife, so I took the youngest lad for a walk. We saw my uncle driving a car, a de Dion car, and he was driving down full uniform, and he saw us and he waved to us.
Tom Clark, too, was on his way to the rendezvous for which he'd waited so long.
You know, when you read up to the point that you daren't break down, you must make your goodbyes as casual as is possible. You see, you understand that. Unless it was goodbye. I don't know whether we even shook hands.
We marched from Kimmage Camp down to the tram line
and got in at Harold's Cross on the first tram that came along. And I went upstairs along with the others, and Plunkett then came upstairs and asked how many were there.
And now George Plunkett paid for everybody's fare. And we got out at O'Connell Bridge and we marched down to Liberty Hall.
Liberty Hall was the rallying point from which volunteers and citizen army men, with the youth and women's organisations, the Fina and Cumann, were to spread out to strong points all over the city.
Now, all the officers of the volunteers were there. Pearse, McDonough, McDermott and all these. And outside was all the volunteers that were going to come, and the Fina boys and Cumann. And there was Fina boys there with pikes. Pikes, you know, imagine going into battle with a pike. When Connolly had everything arranged, he told Captain McCormick to pick a section of men, and he picked 28 men and 8 boys, and I was one of the 8 boys. And we marched out, and we were the first to leave Liberty Hall.
My mother was standing at the door of our home, and she was horrified, I can tell you, when she saw me marching down with a gun on my shoulder. Particularly as I was up in the very front on the left-hand side, nearer to where she was standing. So we marched then up to Clarence Street, and then along Clarence Street and into Boland's Mill. But we marched into the bakery. I didn't tell you, the workers there looked aghast at a lot of armed men marching in, and we told them that the baking would have to stop, so that we were taking over the mills. So some of them asked us what it was all about and all that kind of. They couldn't make head or tail of it any more than some of ourselves couldn't make head or tail of it.
The main body of men, with Connolly, Pearse and Clark, marched to the building in the very centre of Dublin which had been chosen as headquarters for the rising, the General Post Office.
Round about midday, there was a commotion down on the street and the breaking of glass and a lot of, commotion. And everybody wanted to see out through the windows to see what was going on. But shortly after that, the door was banged open, and I was up in the instrument room at where the telegraphs were, and they were a number of men, round about 20, came into the room dressed in green uniforms with rifles in their hand. They ordered everybody to get out immediately, and I think I was one of the last, really, because I was interested in getting a bicycle that I had down in the basement back so as I could get home. And he very, very politely told me that it would be too dangerous and that he wouldn't advise me to try and get it back.
And a little later, passers-by were bewildered to hear an Irish Republic proclaimed by Patrick Pearse from the front of the building.
In the name of God, ran the proclamation which Pearse read out. In the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
I didn't hear him, but I saw him. There was a fairly big crowd around. As I say, I didn't hear him because I was inside, but I could see them.
While mentioning the support of gallant allies in Europe, the Germans, the proclamation said that Ireland depended first on her own strength and was striking in full confidence of victory. The first victory was over a party of lancers jingling down O'Connell Street, apparently unaware of what was happening. Some volunteers were still on their way to the General Post Office.
I was going up towards the GPO. Firing broke out. This was when the Lancers came down the top of the street, and we took up position in doorways and got ready to defend ourselves. They were just trotting down the street as if they were going towards a barracks or something like that. They weren't actually ready for military action. When the firing had died down, we went on and went into the GPO. Well, there was a scene of Great activity there, and they were filling up mailbags full of coal. It's the only thing they could get, and the cellars are full of coal in the place. The first thing I knew, I was drafted into the coal detail. And we were nearly smothered. The dust was rising all over the place.
I was immediately put to carrying sacks of nails and sand to barricade the front windows of the post office.
Now, the inside, we barricaded all the windows that we were allotted to. They were barricaded. Barricaded with a lot of stuff that we got from the waxworks further down Henry Street. Remember, there was a waxworks there. Effigies of the King and the Queen and Kitchener and all kinds of, well, they were the, we used them to stick on the windows, the barricade.
And having barricaded themselves in, the rebels in the GPO awaited the reaction of the British. Jacob's biscuit factory, which commanded Portobello Barracks, was also being taken over. But opposition to the rising came from other quarters besides the British Army.
After some odd adventures, I got as far as Jacob's, and by God, there was a hostile crowd there, waving Union Jacks, calling on the lads inside, come out, you lot of effing slackers. If you want to fight, go out and fight in France and all this. They were waving Union Jacks and God knows what.
And as we came out on the street, there was a terrible hullabaloo of women and men. They were like, had sons and people in the British Army. And they called us all the names you could think of, you know, and one man made a grab at a rifle. So the Lieutenant Burden says to him, keep your hands off now, he said, you'll be sorry. So he wouldn't. So Burden shot him.
Another early casualty had been an Irish policeman shot dead at the gate of Dublin Castle, the very centre of British rule in Ireland. But though it was virtually undefended, the rebels didn't press the attack home. The same Monday afternoon, a column of elderly reservists, known from the words Georgius Rex on their belts as the Gorgeous Rex, had been out in the Dublin mountains unaware of events in the city.
We saw the poor members of Gorgeous Rex coming back. They all had rifles, but no ammunition. And the next thing we heard a volley, and the poor unfortunates, one of them I think was shot dead.
4 were killed, in fact, 8 wounded. In the centre of Dublin, the chief event had been not military at all, but civilian, looting.
It was really swarms of people coming from all the side streets and all over the streets, crossing O'Connell Street to get into a shop called Cleary's, because it was the Harrods of Dublin, really.
As we say in Dublin, all the old ones were out and putting sacks across their backs, full of all kinds of things, you know.
Women were carrying and wearing fur coats and carrying loads of furs and clothes, and men were bent double, carrying great bales of material, tweeds and things like that.
I saw one fellow go along with the dress suit on him in the middle of the day. Yeah, and he had a golf club.
And then they used to have a row with each other, because one old lady would take from the other old lady, you know, if she thought there was more in her sack. And there was a lot of punch-ups. I saw one old one catch the other old lady by the hair and pull her across the road, you know. It wasn't nice.
Although it was horrifying to see, it was the poor people of Dublin really had a ball.
There were about 1,000 rebels out altogether by now. There were 2,500 British troops based in Dublin, but of these only some 400 were on permanent alert, spread over different barracks of the city. The rest were away at Fairy House races or otherwise enjoying the public holiday. Reinforcements were at once sent for. 1,600 men from the Curragh, artillery from Athlone, and from England 2 infantry brigades, which arrived at Kingstown Harbour on Wednesday morning.
We arrived in Kingston. It was 5 minutes 5:30 in the morning by the clock at Kingston Harbour when we got there, and we were put on the wharf sort of thing, and the women, they came down there literally in dozens and dozens and dozens, bringing tea, biscuits, cakes.
They were just like one of us. They were pleased as, they seemed as pleased as could be that we had arrived.
The loyal Irish was showering us with bars of chocolate and fruit.
Everywhere we went, we could have had 10 breakfasts a day if we'd have wished. Honestly, the Irish people then, they couldn't have treated us better if it had been their own.
These troop reinforcements from England set off for Dublin in 2 columns. One column met no opposition and, taking another breakfast or 2 on the way, marched round the city to bivouac safely at Kilmainham. Here they joined the cordon of troops, English and Irish, being thrown round the rebels in the centre of the city, and took up positions preparatory to drawing that cordon tighter still. Action in the centre of Dublin was still only sporadic, and meanwhile the other column had run into deep trouble. What happened was that, proceeding unconcernedly down Northumberland Road towards the centre of Dublin, at the junction of Northumberland Road and Haddington Road, by Mount Street Bridge, they ran into small outposts of the rebel strong point at Boland's Mill. In this house, the rebel outpost consisted of 2 men.
Around about 1 o'clock in the day, we heard the noise of marching men and looked out, and here we saw, as we thought, the whole British Army coming in. And they were marching along quite unconcernedly. They hadn't been fired on up till then. And the men in number 25 waited until they got to the junction of Haddington Road and Northumberland Road, and they opened fire on them.
Oh, it was from the other side of the street. They were just firing from the bedroom windows, and we'd no shelter at all, so the casualties were pretty heavy.
Some of them fell dead, others threw themselves on the ground, because they didn't know from where the firing was coming. So then, of course, after that, they didn't march. They actually crept on their tummies along the road.
We had to stop naturally and take what cover we could. I believe it was there where Colonel Fane gave the orders to attack this place. Well, it was futile, you know. They've got to go across an open ground, and well, he hadn't gone many yards before he was face down.
He was wounded, and he came out with, now I don't know whether it was his sword or not, but he came out and tried to rally the soldiers. And so, really, although at the time we wanted every British person to be shot, but you couldn't but admire him when he came right out into the middle of the street again and got them together.
Well, we thought there were probably 200 or 300, but apparently they weren't. But their fire was so good and so accurate that they misled the troops as to the numbers.
It would have been between 6:30 and 7. It was still bright. And when they made an almighty rush.
Under heavy fire, we sent the hand grenade people in, and they were throwing the grenades in and burnt and busted them out.
And they got up the steps and they threw a bomb at the door, and we heard an explosion and we saw a bright light, and we knew it was the end of those 2.
It was a bit rough, as I say. We lost an awful lot of men around about, an awful lot. I was one of the lucky ones.
There'd been only 17 rebels altogether in all these outposts of the Mount Street Bridge area. British casualties were 230 killed and wounded, nearly half those of the entire rising. Meanwhile, in Dublin itself, where the bombardment of British artillery had already started fires, the infantry were, by the next day, Thursday, moving steadily in towards the centre.
When it became daylight the next morning, there was, crowds of furniture of all descriptions had been brought out of these houses and put in the road to make the roads impassable to traffic. I even saw a piano pushed out into the road, bedsteads, brought them out in pieces and put them up and make a big obstruction of them, and that's how it went on.
Making their way through North King Street, the South Staffs Regiment killed 12 civilians and dished out tough treatment to the other people who lived there.
And of course, if we thought there was somebody in, well, to make sure before you stopped anything, you put your bayonet in for a start, to make sure. And then the beds, you perhaps find 2 or 3, or perhaps 4 in the bed there, looked like old people, or it was perhaps young uns, you know, as making themselves look old. So anyway, the captain's instruction was, same as he said about putting the bayonet in that clothing business in the corner. If they give them a chance to get out, if they don't, up goes the bed, he said. Chuck them all out on the floor, never mind about them if they squeal or anything, just tip them out.
But what had it been like waiting in the various rebel strongpoints in the centre with, on the whole, not much happening?
Nothing eventually happened. We were never attacked. The only thing was that in the middle of the week, word was sent around that the German army had landed, and there was a great cheer. For half an hour there was cheering that we, Allies in Germany had come to us, you know. But it was all a cod. No such a thing happened.
One day, the garrison at the GPO perceived a curious object outside.
Well, this thing, it was constructed at Guinness, and it was a loco boiler, I think, a locomotive boiler with a firebox at the back, and they mounted it on this lorry, you see, this lorry chassis. But there were a few slots cut in, you see, for observation, and there were some dummy slots.
And one night all the lights went out, and we heard a terrible clanking at the top of the street. And dimly we could see some kind of a big lorry with a boiler on it coming around. And I said to this other fellow, Sammy, I said, I think I see 2 slits in the front. Would you go for the right one? I'll go for the left. And we must have done some harm because the thing came to a dead stop.
A bullet came through one of the slots and wounded someone.
And later on, another armoured vehicle came along and towed it away.
As the British tightened their cordon round the 2 last central strongpoints, a makeshift gunboat on the River Liffey, the Helga, was brought into action. The real damage was being done by 2 18-pounder guns firing at close range in the streets. By darkness on Friday, the rebel headquarters and the post office itself were on fire, the whole scene an awesome sight to the population by night and day.
As far as we could see, the sky was just one enormous mass of flame. Tremendous, enormous mass of flame. And we felt that the whole centre of the city was being destroyed by fire.
It was absolutely lit up as light as day from the fires that were burning all the way around and sparks and that coming off the buildings.
It was a mess, absolutely. It was just blackened. I mean, everything was topsy-turvy.
By Saturday morning, the centre of Dublin, second city of the British Empire, was looking like the devastated towns of France and Belgium on the Western Front. The end was close at hand. The rebels had evacuated their blazing headquarters in the GPO. One party crossed to the shelter of houses on the other side of the adjoining street.
I wasn't very long on the other side before I was approached by Jim Ryan afterwards, Dr. Jim Ryan. And he brought me into the end house and told me to dig up one of the poles of a stretcher. And I looked on the stretcher and it was Connolly who was there. So we began to move him. Now in street fighting when you're making a line of entry along the street, you start on the ground floor, you bore a hole sufficiently wide to get people through, and then you go to the next floor, the next of the house you have gone into, and keep that pattern so that you won't be enfiladed by fire. And we had to carry Connolly through this, take him upstairs one house, downstairs the other, through the hole in the wall. And he was in terrible agony. Gangrene had set in the ankle where he was shot. And eventually we got him about halfway up the street, and we were told to leave him there, that was going to be the headquarters.
The O'Reilly, a founder of the volunteers, though against the rising, led the rest of the garrison from the GPO. In the poet Yeats's words, having helped to wind the clock, he'd come to hear it strike.
Down Moore Street we charged, and the O'Reilly was well in front, and we got as far as the corner of Riddler Row. He sacked the lane just the other side, and he was shot there, just opposite that lane. I saw him fall on his face and the sword fall out of his hand. And I saw him then turn on his left side. He was in great pain, and he made the sign of the cross. And he lay down just for perhaps a second and dragged himself, I should say, from about here to yonder, 4 or 5 yards to Sackville Lane corner, and lay down there for the last time he died.
The Dion car in which the O'Reilly had driven to the fight was found afterwards in the rest of the wreckage of Dublin.
And then towards evening, just while it was getting dusk, word came through the grapevine that Pearse had gone out to surrender.
He'd gone out after getting a note from the commander of the British forces in Dublin, General Lowe. The note had been written at General Lowe's dictation by his son, John Lowe, a later film star known as John Loder.
Yes, that's my handwriting, all right. And a nurse in Red Cross uniform came in to headquarters, my father's headquarters, with a message from Pearse, who was the revolutionary commander-in-chief or commander, saying he wished to surrender. So then my father told me to take a letter, which I did, and that is the letter, that is my handwriting. And we met Pearse. I was wearing cavalry twill, which was a very smart material then, breeches, and they were sort of a light cream coffee color. He arrived and said to my father he wished and was empowered to surrender. So my father said, all right, and turned to me and he said, take Mr. Pearse to Kilmainham jail.
Other surrenders followed at the South Dublin Union.
Kent called his men together, and he told them that of the surrender of headquarters unconditionally. The men told him, and some of them were scarcely satisfied to surrender, but he said, I'll say this, when Tom Clark, that served 15 years in British dungeons, surrendered, I don't think it is any shame on us to surrender.
Reluctantly, all the garrisons surrendered. The leader of that at Boland's Mill, a virtually unknown mathematics teacher, Eamon de Valera. A better-known Dublin figure, Constance Markowitz, here on the right, surrendered with Michael Mallin at Stephen's Green. Some prisoners were held on open ground.
And we were addressed by Sean McDermott, who praised everybody for the fight they had put up, and said, of course, we'll all be executed, but it's up to you fellas to carry on the struggle afterwards.
As bewildered Dubliners stared at the ruins of their city, wondering why it had all happened, questions about the future filled the air. Above all, the immediate question, what would be done with the prisoners?
We were kept all night under the supervision of Captain Lee Wilson. During the night, he pulled out old Tom Clark and Willie Pearse and others, stripped them naked and abused them. He said, if Tom Clark, this old bastard's been at it before, he said he has a shop across the way there. And then officers came around with notebooks taking down names and addresses. And one incident which struck me at the time was after the officer who took down my name had passed me and another after me, he came to a third fellow and he had a look at him and he wrote something in the book and passed on. So we turned to this fellow and asked him, did the officer know him? And he said, that's my brother. So the following morning then we were marched through the streets as we came down O'Connell Street. The flag post with the tricolour had been shot down, but the flag still hung over the portico. And we raised a great cheer and got a lot of abuse from our escort. And then we were marched up the quays and on to Richmond Barracks, the old Richmond Barracks out in Inchicore. We were taken into the gymnasium there. All the G men were unloosed on us, the G division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. And they went around saying, you out, you out. They picked out all the leaders and anybody whom they knew.
Many of the rank and file were marched off to internment camps in England. They'd rebelled against the government of their country in time of war, but only a selected number, De Valera among them, were court-martialed. Of the rank and file, some were little more than boys, and these their captors treated with reasonable leniency. Among them was a later IRA man.
Brought before 3 officers and they said, where were you during the rebellion? I said, in Jacobs. What were you doing there? Fighting for Ireland. Didn't afford a shot. But however, my fingerprints was taken and I was told, get out.
They brought us into the orderly room in Richmond Barracks. It was beside the guard room. And there were a lot of brass hats sitting down. What I mean by brass hats is high-ranking officers. And this officer addressed us and he said to us, you are thoughtless youths and you've been led by madmen and maniacs. Go home and get your mother to wipe your nose.
Those who were marched off to internment in Britain were left in no doubt about what the people of Dublin thought of their rebellion.
There was a whole series of demonstrations while we were marched down, and it was fortunate for us that we had 2 rows of British soldiers on either side of us, or some of the women there they shouted all sorts of expletive at us and told the soldiers to shoot the bastards. So I can say this much definitely, that the rising in Dublin certainly was not popular in 1916. I say that without fear of contradiction.
Not popular, yet Ireland's history had been too sensitive and complex a thing for rebels to be dismissed easily as the madmen they seemed to most people to be. It was all over in one way. Crowds gathered to stare at whatever there might be to be stared at. Routine patrols of troops sauntered through the streets. But dust and smoke from buildings destroyed by the British shelling still filled the air, and the centre of Dublin at least was changed utterly. 300 civilians had been killed, 60 rebels, and 130 British troops. Together with the rubble, there were many confused thoughts to be cleared up. Nothing like this had happened in Ireland for well over 100 years. Irish rebels had held the British Army at bay for nearly a week. And though in that British Army many of the regiments which had put the Rising down were Irish, it was Irish rebels of one sort or another who were the heroes of Irish history. People began to turn their attention to these Easter rebels, and however much they deplored their action, to feel at the same time a bit proud of them. what would be done with those being tried by the courts-martial which were now proceeding? From Dublin, one of the Irish parliamentary leaders wrote that so far the feeling of the population there was against the rebels, but if there were shootings of prisoners on any large scale, the effect on public opinion might be disastrous. Three days after the surrender of the men who'd been in the gutted post office, it was announced that 3 of the leaders had been shot. Tom Clark, Thomas McDonough, Patrick Pearse. Possibly, if the executions had stopped there, future history would have been different. But they did not stop there.
I was brought into a room where there were 3 high British officers for court-martial. I was along with Willie Pearse, J.J. Walsh, Sean McGarry, and then myself. Willie Pearse was first to be questioned, and he said that he was not in charge of any troops. He was only a personal attaché of his brother. We were marched out of the court and away to Kilmainham jail. And I don't know what time it was, but it was probably after midnight. A military policeman or a sergeant or something came with 2 privates and told me that I had been court-martialed and sentenced to death. He says, "Do you understand?" I said, "Yes." He said, after a pause, he said, "It has been commuted to 10 years penal servitude. Do you understand?" I said, "Yes." "Do you want something to eat?" I said, "Yes."
Willie Pearse was executed on the 4th of May with 3 others. Joseph Plunkett, Edward Daly, Michael O'Hanrahan. Of the 77 death sentences passed, most were to be commuted. But all the public knew for sure was that 7 had now been carried out. And they were wondering, with an ever-increasing sense of dread, how many more would be carried out. On the 5th of May, there was 1 execution, John McBride. The Irish Home Rule Party drafted a resolution condemning the rising, but also condemning the executions, and again stressing that any more would have the most disastrous effect on the future loyalty of the Irish people. On the 8th of May, 4 more executions: Cornelius Colbert, Eamon Kent, Michael Mallin, Sean Houston. And on the 9th of May, Thomas Kent, who'd killed a policeman while resisting arrest, was shot. An Irish woman wrote, "It was like watching a stream of blood coming from under a closed door." Many Irishmen, while condemning the rebels, had had a sneaking sympathy for them.
I wrote down in my diary something which I summed up by saying, "My heart is with them and my mind is against them." That's what I thought. And from the very beginning, I was admiring them, although I knew I wasn't any personally concerned in any way at all. So that was my reaction.
What effect did the executions have on you?
The same as it had on everybody else. Made me completely and absolutely pro them, and I became a political Irishman from that day.
On the 12th of May, Sean McDermott was shot. And last of all, though no one then knew that he would be the last, James Connolly, shot because he couldn't stand on his wounded ankle, in a chair.
So when we got into my father, he said, "Well, Lily," he said, "I suppose you know what this means." I said, "Oh, no. Oh, no, not that." He said, "Yes, Lily." She broke down then and she said, "But your beautiful life, James. She said, your beautiful life. And he said, wasn't it a full life, Lillian? Isn't this a good end? And she still cried, so he says, look, Lily, please don't cry. He says, you'll unman me. So she tried to control herself. I was trying to control myself, too. Then he said to me, put your hand down on the bed. So I put it down on the bed. And he said, that's a copy of my statement to the court-martial. Try and get it out. So piece of paper was folded up very tightly, not bigger than that. So I took it anyway. And we were there, I talked about little things. He was trying to plan our life for him after he was gone. And then they told us time was up and we'd have to go. He used to be shot at dawn, you see. So Mom, we couldn't get Mom away from the bed. The nurse had to come finally and help her away. And I went to the door, and then I went back to him. That was the last I saw him.
The Sinn Féin Rebellion, the newspapers and the public had called it, after a nationalist but non-violent movement named Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin had had nothing to do with the rising, but so little did the public know of the rising's real leaders and their motives that they gave it the name Sinn Féin for want of anything more precise. What really had been the motives of the rebel leaders? Mrs. Clark went to see her husband, Tom Clark, in Kilmainham jail the night before he was executed.
We had a soldier in the cell all the time. They had, the only lights they had was candles in jam pots. And it was just the one candle brought up the stairs, and he stood in the cell with me. It got about an hour. Well, even then we didn't talk about anything about ourselves. We talked about the future and the future of the country. And he said, we, all of us that are going out tonight, he said, believe that we have saved the soul of Ireland, that we have struck the first successful blow to freedom, and that freedom is coming. But between this and freedom, he said, Ireland will go through hell. But he said, Ireland will never lie down again.